People are voting for change. It's very positive.
This election, then, in that sense, is a kind of a watershed moment.
NHI is an existential threat to the country, because if we wreck the private healthcare sector, we won't be able to hold the middle class.
The EFF seems to have, over these years, just hit a ceiling at around 10%. What's been holding that back?
What's changed is the gentleman from Nkandla. Mr. Zuma is back. We're out of loadshedding. We'll talk about that in a moment. That was a call we made 18 months ago, and we were alone. If you gave me only one indicator, you sent me away, you gave me one indicator to watch on South Africa. If we get that right, then the odds become very good that South Africa is going to become prosperous and remain a free society. Regardless, I think, of what happens in the election or what happens afterwards, communities that go to great lengths on that have a very good chance of a long, successful, peaceful and prosperous future in South Africa.
Welcome, and thank you for taking the time to watch and to listen to this conversation. One of the reasons that I thought it would be important as a community that we have this opportunity to reflect, and that's why I wanted to speak to Dr. Frans Cronje, who is one of the premier analysts in our country. He heads up the Social Research Foundation, the SRF, which has fast become the one of the leading think tanks and sources of information, polling data, attitudes and opinions within the country. And as you know, Dr. Cronje and I have had conversations over the last 2 years. The theme of all of these conversations, and that's why I thought it's so important now as we head towards elections, is to really take out of things this emotional knee-jerk reaction to things. It's about looking for perspective and really understanding, but understanding not based on the latest statement of a politician, but really to understand the big perspective of the country and to get to the bottom and to have the insight based on facts, information, data, and to do that in a rational, intellectual way so that we can really understand what's going on. So Dr. Cronje, thank you so much for your time, and over these years so enjoyed the conversations and everything that you have to add. I think as we're heading towards elections, I suppose what's top of people's minds is really the sense of what's going to happen, and kind of peering into your crystal ball, or the crystal ball of an analyst, which is really the data, the polls. What does it tell you?
Chief Rabbi, it's a pleasure to be here. Let's quickly go back 30 years to see what's changed. The ANC comes to power in 1994. It's got 63% of the vote. A decade later, in 2004, it's got almost 70%, so it's up 6 points. This morning, on a tracking poll that the SRF is running, the ANC is on about 43%. So it's lost 25 odd percentage points since the peak point of 2004. We understand exactly why that's happened. In the first decade after 1994, the ANC did very well to raise the basic living standards of millions of people. The number of South Africans with a job essentially doubled in the first decade and a bit. After democracy, we saw the rollout of the most expansive welfare program of any emerging market. The number of welfare grants paid increased from 2.5 to about 12.5 million. 10 formal houses were built in that first decade for every one new shack that was erected in the country. And the share of families that went to bed without electricity every evening fell from 49% on the first evening that South Africa celebrated its democracy to under 20%, was 19%, when Mr. Mbeki ultimately packed up his office. At the same time, the ANC had secured a remarkable economic turnaround. Government debt levels had been cut in half from 48% to 27% of GDP, and the first budget surplus had been recorded since the formation of the Union of South Africa in 1910. So it was a good era, and ANC was rewarded politically. Over the subsequent 15 or so years to today, living standards stagnated, and then they began to reverse. And real per capita GDP, which is a good measure of that sort of thing, has been down for several years now, one year after the other after the other. There's a misnomer in the country that the ANC can govern with impunity, that there are no consequences for bad governance. But if you study the micro-political data on the country, that's wrong. And there's an almost immediate negative political consequence as soon as living standards in the country begin to slip. And it's the slippage of the living standards that has brought ANC support levels down to the low of around 45% today. And that's quite a good thing, because what it means is that our political system is working. It hasn't failed. We're not at the point of some terrible political collapse. Now, 1994 wasn't a mistake. It hasn't all become a disaster of chaos and turmoil. What it in fact means is we're in the fortunate minority of emerging markets that at the end of their first post-colonial government have the prospect to change peacefully, which is what's going to happen on the 29th of May. The alternative is that you change violently and young people pick up rifles to change the government. That's not going to happen here. It's going to be a bit of turbulence. It's going to be a bit unstable. It's going to be a bit uncertain about how it's going to happen. But we can be very fortunate. Firstly, I'll make some more points about what we can be fortunate about as we go on through this conversation, that we are now in the minority of post-colonial emerging markets with a working political system that enforces consequences for failures of governance and policy and allow the society that you're in to transition peacefully from one administration to the next.
So I think this is a vital point, because what you're saying is in the early years when the ANC was delivering to the country, its support went up from the 63 to the 70, and then when it stopped, then it's exactly tracking, the voting percentage is tracking performance.
Yes, and I can tell you, if you sit in a meeting of senior ANC leaders and you set out this kind of information, they will agree with every word of it, that they had a good run initially and they were rewarded accordingly, and that the reason they're now on the brink of a national election defeat at a national level, they did go under 50% in the local election in 2021, is because of governance failures and the inability to shore up the basic living standards of people. It's a very dangerous thing to do, what the ANC did in the first decade. If you start the process of economic emancipation, you create expectations, rightly so, that it will continue. And if you interrupt that process, as the ANC allowed to happen, the expectations curve doesn't slow down and reduce. The expectations curve of people continues to rise. And the gap between the expectations, rightful expectations of a better life for all, to quote the ANC's excellent 1994 election slogan, the expectations can't be met, and the consequence is that people are voting differently. And that is the reason why the ANC is now below 50. So point one from me to all the many audiences I talk to, look very worried about the country, and you should be a little bit worried, but extremely worried, is point one, the political system is working as it was intended. Remember, we became a democracy 30 years ago, so that if a point was reached where the country was not well governed to the advantage of all its people, the people would have the ability to do something about that. And that is all that's happening at the moment in our politics. The people have got fed up and they're voting differently to bring about a different kind of administration to rule the country after May the 29th.
And I think that's really what sort of modern global history has taught, is that democracies have a way of self-correcting and that they go through ups and downs, but ultimately, as long as those free and fair elections continue and you have this kind of oxygen of freedom and a Bill of Rights, independent judiciary and all of the mechanism, as long as that oxygen is pumping into the society, then it can breathe and it can find its way to the self-correction, which is, I think, this election then in that sense is a kind of a watershed moment for the country, because on the indications of what you're saying, it's going to be the first time that the ANC goes below the 50%. I mean, how are you seeing kind of the lay of the land from this election based on the polling, you know, that you've done so far?
Okay, we've been tracking ANC support quite closely for the last 3 years or so at the SRF. And in 2022 and in 2023, if you take our polls, and in fact you average those with everyone else's data, so groups like Ipsos and the like, on average we had the ANC at about 48%, and we had the DA I think on 23 or 24, and we had the EFF on about 11. Now that remained the case through 2022, and it remained the case through 2023. 2024 it's very different. If you average everything that's been done, then we'll get to what's going on this week, which is different to that. Everything that's been done, the ANC is nearer to 40% than to 50%. The DA is still basically where it was in the mid-20s, 2023, 24 or so. The EFF is a little bit down on the 11 that it had. It's nearer around an 8. What's changed is the gentleman from Nkandla. Mr. Zuma is back with his MK party, and he is sitting at around 10 percentage points. And it's the points, those points are taken partly off the EFF and partly off the ANC. And that's what's brought the contemporary ANC number, the average number for 2024, down to nearer 40%, to the 50% that it was at in 2022 and 2023.
Just one point that maybe is worth reflecting on, even before the entrance of the MK party, the EFF seems to have, over these years, just hit a ceiling at around 10%. And maybe you could explain that, because let's say in a country where there is dissatisfaction with the ANC, people have not moved to the EFF. What's been holding that back? I mean, they still stuck at around that 10%, and now you say they're even below that.
Okay, we've covered one, what I call countervailing force in favour of the country's success, which is that our democratic system works exactly as intended, and we're fortunate that that's the case. Second countervailing force is what you lead me to here. About 70% of young people in South Africa do not have a job, which is massive levels of contemporary economic exclusion. Despite that, a party such as the EFF, with its brilliant marketing, a shrewd leadership, a clear message, you can't be in any doubt as to what it stands for, you can't not be aware that it exists, has struggled to hold support levels north of 10%. And that's been a sort of apparent contradiction in the country. How's that possible? You have this massive number of desperately poor people, young people with access to information, social media, that could easily be radicalised, and yet the EFF's unable to achieve that. Chief reason for that is that public opinion in South Africa is immensely moderate, centrist and pragmatic. A comfortable 8 out of 10 South Africans are with each other. They respect each other across lines of race and class and history and politics. They have the same desires for their kids and for their families. They want to come to cities. They want to live in safe neighborhoods. They want to send their children to good schools. They want to work so they can care for their families. And they want to accumulate wealth and assets. We are not a radicalized populace. And that is the reason why the radical populists have yet to make considerable inroads into the country's politics. In the fullness of time, that might, of course, change. If we squander this opportunity of this election and the administration that comes after it to actually address the real needs of millions of desperately poor South Africans, there's no telling what might happen in the future. But over the past 30 years, and in fact before that, because there's excellent data that exists through the 70s and the 80s even, and into the 90s. And for the foreseeable future, public opinion is moderate and centrist. And if we can capitalize on that, we have a serious prospect of realizing a much more successful long-term horizon for the country. It's a very different kind of problem, therefore, we face politically to if we were a country in which youth opinion had been radicalized in pursuit of destructive and populist ideals. If that was the case, it would be very difficult for me to sit here and tell you that into the medium term there is a realistic prospect for the country to be a success. We are fortunate again that we're not yet at that point. There is a South African thing that you encounter, and I see it a lot, and I have a great understanding of it, and it's not unjustified, but it's a view often in the middle classes that where the country is today is about the worst thing that could ever have happened to any society in all of history. We are completely doomed. It's never going to work out, and we must run away to somewhere else. And there are reasons for that, and many of those are legitimate. But if you have a proper appreciation of history, if I briefed you, for example, on the Sudanese civil war, the understanding would be immediate that the problems that we face are relatively minor, and in fact we have assets, countervailing forces, the working political system, public opinion, that we can use to become a very successful society.
And maybe just to add to some of those features, the working political system, the freedom, independent judiciary, free press, but also, as you said, the public opinion, which is deeper, which is a reflection of the values and the kind of life view of the people, but also a very young population and an English-speaking country. I mean, in terms of sort of features for success of a country, are those, I think Europe is struggling with an aging population, and sort of Africa in general, and South Africa in particular, a young population. If we can get the right sort of economic growth, that can be a tremendous advantage.
Multicultural societies are very difficult to run, where cultures are a sort of assembly of values that inform one's view of the world and your behavior. Multiracial societies are much easier to run because culture becomes the challenge, not race so much. And you can define culture in many ways. You can do it narrowly, but you can also do it broadly. And if culture is essentially, to be in our case defined as the pursuit of essentially Western values, Western middle class standard of living is the ideal that we pursue. We value life, we value freedom, the ability to speak out. Then South Africa is not in fact as multicultural a society as it could seem to the sort of uninitiated observer from outside, because there is very broad common ground across those lines of history and class and politics and even race in terms of the values that inform people's sort of expectations and hopes and dreams. And that, you can say, third countervailing force is that we have to a very great degree a common value set that transcends socio-economic differences. And that means, again, that it will be easier to make a country like South Africa a success than were we a society that had various groups with completely opposing value sets and therefore cultures that had to be assembled into one successul society.
Before we get into kind of what the potential coalitions and what could emerge practically from these elections, just to, this kind of the building blocks of positive forces that prepare the way for the reasonable potential for a successful future. I think just to maybe give people context on your own background, because there have been times. At the moment, let's say there's a lot of pessimism from all different kinds of people, but there have been times when people were optimistic, and you were actually sounding the warning bell about the future. And so I think the reason I mention this is that sometimes people get locked in this thing of you have optimists and you have pessimists, and really it's not about optimism or pessimism. It's actually about analytics, rationality, looking at the broad sweep, looking at the factors which favor success, the risk elements, looking at holistically. I mean, that's your background, and you kind of go where the data leads. I want to just put that in perspective here, because the purpose of this conversation is not to make the Jewish community or anyone in South Africa feel better or worse about the country. It's actually just to say what's going on, because without the information, without the data, and without the perspective, we can get lost in a sea of emotions.
Yeah, look, hope and fear have no place in this sort of work, in this sort of analysis. I've been doing this stuff for 20 years, and they lead you astray. And it was frustrating for much of the 20 years because often...
Maybe just remind people listening, your 20 years, like what...
Yeah, I spent a great part of those 20 years working for a storied South African think tank established in the 1920s, rose to become the most prominent anti-apartheid think tank in the world, the South African Institute of Race Relations. And started at the bottom and became its CEO and left a couple of years ago. And I had the great privilege there of an exceptional team of analysts and thinkers, and a tradition of obtaining the highest quality information, both in terms of data, socio-economic information, also understanding of what people and politicians and business leaders and diplomats were likely to do. And if you want to do this kind of work well, the quality of your information must be absolutely exceptional. And then all you need to do is get the analysis correct. And that's the objective. And for much of the period between, I'd say, 2008 and a few years ago, we had a hard time. Because we'd walk into a lot of rooms where we'd say to people, look here, it's not going to be great. you're not going to see an economic recovery. The lights are going to go out. In 2012, and it's on the record in print, we said the ANC is going to lose the election in 2024. And the reason we said that is we understood the relationship between socio-economics and ANC support levels, and we could apply demographic trends to that. And we had a very good idea of who the leaders of the ANC would be and the policies they'd introduce, and they would not be reformers. I can tell you, walking into those rooms in that era and saying, look, we're in serious trouble and it's going to become rough, we weren't always popular. When Mr. Ramaphosa was anointed, and it was a very sort of euphoric time, we sounded a cautionary note. We did it, and there's this apocryphal story of Zhou Enlai, the Chinese leader, telling Nixon, who asked him apparently what he thought the implications of the French Revolution were, that it's too soon to tell. And on Mr. Ramaphosa, we said to very euphoric groups of great influence, at the very least, it's too soon to tell. And we did not believe he was a reformer. And he's turned out not to be that, for many reasons. And that was difficult. So we got calls right, and that's what matters. It's been an interesting past 2 or 3 years because sentiment on South Africa has shifted to where many groups believe there isn't a future, one that's desirable to live in anymore. And you should be hedged on South Africa, and you should be cautious because it can go wrong. So of course, it certainly can. It's a normal, volatile, emerging market. However, on the balance of probabilities, we see an assembly of what you might call nascent or emerging trends, such as the political system. People are voting for change. It's very positive. Public opinion has remained completely moderate. We're out of load shedding. We'll talk about that in a moment. That was a call we made 18 months ago, and we were alone.
We had this conversation in one of our Zoom webinars with the community, and you made the prediction that we'd come out of the load shedding. And I thought at the time it was very bold to say that.
And we were alone in that, and there was skepticism, which is fine. I mean, we really do not mind skepticism or criticism. But we knew load shedding was going to end. Because
the people who are saying this is an election gimmick, you know.
When André de Ruyter left at the end of 2022, whatever his many merits may have been, there was a serious strategic mistake being committed in Eskom and the cabinet. And that was an attempt to allow the rundown, because it was running down, of the coal fleet to lead to a green transition. We did the maths on a lot of this, and it was simply impossible. There was no way that a green transition could deliver the quantum of electricity we thought in practice total peak hour production would need to double over 10 years for South Africa to erode its unemployment number at a rate necessary to secure its long-term political stability. But the cabinet had bought into this transition. We knew as de Ruyter was leaving that the view had changed, and that the new energy minister had a much more sensible and pragmatic and correct approach, which would be to aid the coal station managers to get the support they needed to shore up Eskom's production. If you look at the data today versus that of 12 or 16 or 18 months ago when we first made that call, the reason, at the time we were at stage 5 load shedding, round about there. At the moment we're at stage nothing. For 40 days, the things one celebrates. And the reason we're not there is that coal production is significantly up. It's 60% of the reason why there's no load shedding. 40% of the reason, it's a bit more complicated than that, but for these purposes it suffices, is demand shifted onto rooftops. Both were essential, but without coal it could not have happened. And into the long-term future, in the face of the vast criticism to the contrary, South Africa will not liberate 20 million black people from terrible poverty and oppression if it is not given the space to refurbish its existing coal fleet, which is the shortest track between now and 3 years, which is what it would take, to deliver the quantum of electricity to the economy to allow the growth rate to break the unemployment deadlock. And that's not to say, which our critics in Europe and America will, although they should be reminded that we are not a colony that can be dictated to from Europe. Our critics say we cannot do this because of their climate ideology. South Africa is going to have to be very firm that we will do this because it is the moral imperative now to beat domestic poverty. But that this does not mean that we are banking on hydrocarbons deep into the future. We just need a period of 20 years, which is in itself a very short period of time, to stage a planned and reasonable transition to cleaner fuel sources, nuclear, green, especially when storage technologies around green energy have improved. So we got the call right, not because we guessed, but because we knew what was going to happen. And if we say something and make a very firm call on the country, it is because we know. If we're not certain, we say we're uncertain, we don't know, and that's a good sort of just point to make as we go deeper into this conversation.
Yeah, so I mean what you're saying is it's not an election gimmick of just burning fuel, burning the diesel. It's actually because of the changes which you predicted 18 months ago.
It's not a gimmick by burning diesel. There's a lot of diesel burning going on, but it's strategic and it's at the right time of the day. And obviously the pressure of the election has helped to sort of get the governments in gear on this. And it's perfectly plausible that people who ran out of electricity in the first place, which is an exceptional thing to do, might be capable of messing this up into the future. But this is not at this time a gimmick. This is the function of the energy minister and the cabinet actually getting it right, and they deserve support and congratulation to stay the course with this in the face of the terrible criticism they're going to continue facing, so that into whatever comes after the 29th of May, we can check the energy box, that we don't have a concrete ceiling pinning the economic growth rate to 1%, but that we generate enough out of a refurbished coal fleet that we can raise the energy ceiling on growth to enable a growth rate of between 3 and 4% initially, then moving to 5%. Because if we get that right, then the odds become very good that South Africa is going to become prosperous and remain a free society. In fact, if you reverse engineer this and you look at rising ANC support between 1994 and 2004 that I set out for you earlier, that tracks perfectly against energy demand and economic growth. And in fact, on job creation, as a rule of thumb that's held true, which it perhaps shouldn't have, but it has, for 30 years, South Africa creates about 100,000 net new jobs per point of GDP growth per year. And if we can take the growth rate up to sustainable 5%, we will knock our current official 30% unemployment rate down to under 10% within the next 20 years. And if you gave me only one indicator, you sent me away, you gave me one indicator to watch on South Africa, from which I could tell you whether the country had been a success and was peaceful and stable or whether it was a mess, I'd watch that 30% unemployment rate. And if over the next 20 years it does walk its way down to 10%, then I'd say to you that the chances were very good that other indicators on freedom, on prosperity, on stability, on peace within the country, that those would look very positive as well.
So, I mean, we need to come back to that because let's say current ANC policies are not conducive to, growth rate and also rate of jobs. I mean, I don't know if we want to discuss that now. We get into election coalition, but I mean, maybe we'll discuss, let's have a look at what's going to happen in these elections. And I would like to come back to this issue of how does the economy grow? How do we create jobs when you have a government that has got policies which are getting in the way of that, and things like NHI and some of the other things. But maybe let's just cast our eye ahead now to the elections and where this lands according to your polls, and what does that mean with the various permutations of coalitions? Because I think the crucial thing is this: whatever happens, South Africa is now in the era of coalitions.
Firstly, polls aren't forecasts. We explain this to mainstream media and we read the next morning that our polls predicted that something would happen. They
maybe just explain that.
They don't do that. What the polls are is they are a slice at a moment in time of opinion. The way I've been explaining it to bankers in the last 2 weeks is you don't take a stab at the rand a month out from the deal you're going to strike, and then don't look at the currency again and do the deal, you'll be surprised and will be reckless. Political opinion is no different to the currency. It moves up and down from day to day based on sentiment in the society. Is it a time in the month when people have money? Is the weather good or bad? Have the sports teams won or lost? Has the government behaved even worse than the track record is? Do you believe that the energy thing is real? So when you see a poll, South Africa's polling record is excellent in terms of accuracy. But it's a poll of the day in question. And a few days later, the figures can be different. One of the things we're doing at SRF to account for this is running a track. So the track means that we are polling every single day, and we have a rolling sample, it's about 2,000 people. And that sample is completely refreshed every few days, and we publish every morning a number. And the number will be, well, several numbers, party support, and then modeled for different turnouts, and we do that at a national level. And we do a particular focus on the Western Cape and Gauteng and KZN because they're battleground provinces. And we also have data for the other provinces, but we don't publish that because the margins of error on that are quite broad, and it would create too much hysterics in the media, and we don't like hysterics and controversy. But we have those numbers. So I told you a few minutes back when we were talking about the ANC's long history that coming into 2024, on average, the ANC is polling at about 40%, just above 40. About 2 weeks ago, that number bottomed out, and the ANC broke just under the 40% level, and it bounced on about a 38 and a 37, and we saw that, and the excellent people at Ipsos, they saw that as well. Over the subsequent 10 days or 14 days to today, the ANC has been ratcheting it up almost every day, sort of a third of a percentage point or half a percentage point. And this morning, on a high turnout model, ANC support is at about 43%, and on a low turnout model, it's at about 45%. Now, those numbers have attached them what's called a margin of error. That's the extent to which we think we could be wrong by, and that's 2 percentage points. So on the high turnout, where we've got the ANC at 43, they might be nearer 45, they might be nearer 41, but we're pretty confident they are at 43%. What you're seeing the ANC do is its famous squeeze. If you've studied South African elections over many years, you'll know that a few weeks out from the election, the opposition stands relatively strongly and the ANC is a bit weaker. And on the day of the election, the ANC is up 2 or 3 or 4 percentage points, and the opposition has lost those points. The reason is the way the ANC campaigns at the end of an election. It will put massive numbers of people on the ground, going house to house, shaking hands. In the early era, receiving the congratulations for the great successes the ANC had been achieved. In the latter era, apologizing for what has befallen their supporters and saying that they will do better. Now, despite that squeeze, the ANC is not going to go back to the highs that it once held, but it might hold a level north of 45%. And I wouldn't say it's very unlikely, but it's not impossible even that if something terrible happens to the people at the MK party, that the ANC could even surprise in hitting a number near a 50 or a 51. I mean, that's where it was until 6 months ago when MK came to power. In the provinces, the position is more dramatic. In Gauteng, the ANC has been stuck in the 30s. It had a very bad day in the last year when it even had a 29. It's fought itself back to near 40% over the last 10 days. In KZN, 2 weeks ago or so, we had 4 parties all in the 20s. That was the IFP in the 20s, the ANC in the 20s, the DA in the 20s, and MK in the 20s. And out of this, deals and governments must be made. And sometimes if you see politicians close up and you show them such numbers, they say to you, well, what deal should we make? And you told you'll have to do it. And it's a very new world for them. And in my insight, which could be limited, is that no firm decision has been taken at this point on the deals that will be struck after the election, a point we'll revisit now. In the Western Cape, the DA may, in the fullness of time, have a problem. It's not only the ANC that's going to face the prospect of coalition deals. The demographics in the Western Cape essentially split 20, 30, 50. 20% white, 30% black, 50% coloured. Western Cape elections traditionally have been a battle to split the coloured vote, and there hasn't ever been strong coloured nationalist leadership. Should that one day emerge, and a person such as Gayton McKenzie, who is an immensely impressive individual, and not someone to be discounted, shrewd, a high caliber strategist, should coloured leadership emerge in the Western Cape, the DA will lose its majority in that province, and it will also have to, at some point, strike coalition deals. So that's where the numbers are at the moment. They're not a forecast, but at this stage, if I had to make a forecast, which you can hold me to account for, the ANC is going to be somewhere near 45, the DA is going to be in the mid-20s, the ANC is going to lose Gauteng, it's going to lose KZN, the DA is going to hold the Western Cape, but by a fairly narrow margin.
And so where would this leave in terms of national coalition, assuming the ANC is below 50, so it needs coalition partners? What are the various scenarios? I mean, if it's really low, closer to 40 or just around above 45, is that going to change it? What's going to be the dynamic? I mean, I know these are going to be deals which are going to be struck, but kind of what are the various options look like? And then, of course, you know, the infamous doomsday one, you know, of ANC, EFF, MK, which, you know, that famous ad of the DA has been going at, and kind of what do you think is the likely outcome, you know, from all of this?
I'll take one step back and then we'll answer. Understand how absolutely historic this is. If you think about the modern sort of South Africa inside the current borders of the country, you might say this is a society that's been coming along for about 400 years. I mean, Union is in 1910, but let's call the modern South Africa a 400-year-old project. At any time over those last 400 years, wherever you were in the borders of the country, there was probably one very powerful, essentially autocratic political actor, whoever that was, who determined the rules by which everyone would live. After 1994, legacy of the apartheid era, the ANC remained very dominant with around 60% of support in the country. But the society of South Africa isn't split into a block of 60% and then another 40%. We are a far more diverse society. What has happened over the 30 years of ANC rule is that as living memory experience of apartheid has faded, so has support for the ANC. And in fact today, if you find an individual who has no living memory experience of apartheid, in that constituency ANC support will now be below 50%. But it remains very strong amongst older rural generations. So what's happening is our politics is beginning to fragment, to reflect the nature of our fragmented and diverse society, and that's a perfectly normal thing to happen. But it's unlikely that we're ever going to go back to the old 400-year-old idea that will identify who is in command, and they will have a clear set of rules, often very poor ones, and we will live by those rules until the guard changes. So this is a new era, and it's so new that it's very different for the politicians as well to get their heads around this. How do you do this? It's not unusual in the rest of the world. Much of Europe is governed like this. Israel is governed along these lines. So firstly, for them, it's a bold new world, and they're not entirely sure how to deal with it. The way to start answering your question and give clarity on what happens next is let's think about three kinds of election results. The first kind is where the ANC is going to get over 50%. For that to happen, MK must be eliminated, and the DA must perform very poorly. Then what likely happens is Mr. Ramaphosa stays around. There's a carrot for him to do that, which is the chairmanship of the G20 next year. The ANC's policies won't change fundamentally. It won't drive dramatic reforms. Growth will remain relatively low. We'll remain a largely free society, and ANC support will continue to tail off. And we know it will tail off because we're reading the ANC's rural support base, which is an older generation. And if you apply mortality estimates to that old ANC, that rural base, you must necessarily, over the next 5 years, cut 5 to 10 points of current ANC support. So if they're over 50, which I've said is a prospect, where they were up till 6 months ago, we'll carry on as we've been the last 5 years. What happens if they are near 50%? So let's say between 45 and 50. What the ANC will then do, this is its plan, is it will find the smallest of the smaller parties and it will offer them positions of power and influence, blue light brigades and titles, and the ANC will be back in power with them. If it's low down in Natal, it will certainly make an offer to the IFP, and I think the correct thing for the IFP to do would be to accept that offer for its own interests and have vast influence, near executive control over KZN. ANC policies will not necessarily change fundamentally. Fiscal prudence will remain. The lights will probably be on more than they're off. There'll be no great reforms to education or crime or security or empowerment or labour.
Similar to option one.
So very similar to option one. So not a lot changes. The third one is the difficult one. What happens if ANC support is nearer 40% than 50%? Because now there are not enough small parties to get back to 50. And even if you tried, the small party is very unreliable. And one or two of them might drop you and collapse your government. An option that's under consideration in the ruling administration is for Mr. Ramaphosa to make a speech along these lines. And it will be catastrophic, remember, for the ANC. I mean, this is 112 years after its formation, and it's lost. And the speech, therefore, will say it's really not about the numbers. These things aren't important. And that this is a historic opportunity for the country to come together again as it has done in the past, which is true. And we shouldn't, as politicians, have been fighting each other as we have. Of course, I don't mean that. They do fight each other. But this will play very well. And he'll then say, I invite a government of national unity, perhaps with the EFF and MK, perhaps without them. And we'll establish this unity government and we'll have a new national convention. And we'll seek national consensus in order to write a new national development plan. I mean, this is the very essence of the man. And that will be very popular in public opinion. The markets will like it. The bankers in London will be very pleased. And it's very dangerous, however, for the opposition. Because can they refuse the offer? Could they say, no, we will not join in this historical moment, take hands with the ANC, cross the historical Rubicon? They can't easily say that. And if they say, yes, we do join, but they don't have executive influence over policy, the opposition could quickly be made jointly culpable for failure if failure follows. And come the election in 2029, voters may say, you know, the DA, the ANC, I mean, they're all together in this. It's not great. They're the same. So very cleverly, the ANC will have moved the impetus away from focus on its own disastrous result to putting the opposition on the back foot. It's a dangerous option, even though it might work, but it's dangerous. There's a third option that some sharp thinkers are starting to consider. And that is not to strike any deal at all in terms of a coalition or a unity government. Instead, to allow the ANC to form a minority government. Let's say it's got 40%. Through the first rounds of voting for president in Parliament, the ANC is allowed to elect its candidate with 40% of the vote. I won't go into technically how you do that, but it's perfectly doable. And once the president has been elected, He has the power to form the executive or the cabinet, executive exclusive power to do so. And he's perhaps told by some of the opposition, please form an ANC government entirely. We don't want a single ministry or any such responsibility. And you go on and govern the country on your own terms. What we want in exchange is key parliamentary portfolio committees and the like. These are very powerful entities. South Africans don't realize that because they've been run by the ANC for so long, has never used them to the full effect. And the opposition would have some influence and a great accountability it could exert through Parliament on the ANC and government. It's a balance of power, this, because if the ANC and government performs terribly badly or terribly corruptly, the opposition could then rightfully say, we withdraw our support for you and we will allow a vote of no confidence to succeed in you. And you and the ANC are then free to go and negotiate a deal with the EFF, who will take you over and seize half the patronage. The ANC would have great influence over the opposition. Said, if you get too difficult with us in Parliament, we'll pull out of this deal as well. So instead of a shotgun marriage, which I think would be an appalling idea and would certainly fail, we start a courtship, as we call it. The opposition in Parliament watching things, the ANC and government carrying on. If that holds for a few weeks, we could then, or months, it's then possible to see if the two sides could perhaps do more work together. So something inoffensive, such as policies for skilled visas. And if that works, perhaps they could do more and more. And in the years ahead of 2029, the courtship could, if they do start to cooperate a bit in government, could go to what we call dating. And if that works around 2029 or perhaps only in the 2030s, the dating could become an engagement. And the two sides could come together. And I think that the best shot, we have many alternatives too, but the best shot at the moment to a long-term prosperous and stable society is to slowly bring the ANC and the DA together in government, but to do it very, very slowly. If it will work for this reason, that if you want to strike a coalition deal that holds, you've got to give the partners in the deal almost everything that they want and very little of what they don't. The ANC wants to be in government. It doesn't want to surrender patronage. It doesn't want to hand half the loot to the EFF or more, which is what the EFF would demand. The DA is highly effective in holding to account and in government, where it governs. But perhaps doesn't have the full spectrum of experience necessary to take over a command of the national administration. So doing it slowly works. What also works is they are not competing for the same voters. The multi-party coalition, which is forced by donor pressure, is a bad idea and can never work. And the reason is that you're trying to get parties with the same values to pursue the same voters in the same coalition. It's a conflict. And hence it is, in practice, the most divided political entity in the country. The DA now commands the established multi-generational middle-class vote, totally multiracial. The ANC could still command the aspirant middle class on the urban periphery. The ANC cannot seize the DA's voters because they're shell-shocked by running out of water and electricity and everything else. The DA struggles to command the aspirant black middle class because it's stigmatized by its critics and in the media as a racist organization, which plainly is not, but that is the stigmatization. And therefore you could say to both sides, look here, you're not going to fish to any significantly successful extent in each other's ponds. The ANC, you don't have to give away a lot to the EFF that will eat you up, will do a reverse takeover, and will put your contemporary leaders on trial for corruption. Just give them the chance to do that. To the DA, you can say, you're not going to be jointly culpable for governance failures. You'll do what you do well, and slowly over time, a deal will arise. Now, if the country pursues that option, I think it could potentially be successful. The third and final option is what the DA has cast as the doomsday. That's putting the ANC and the EFF together. The ANC politicians who would agree to that are as dangerous as the EFF politicians who would benefit from it. And when the EFF tells you what it intends to do with South Africa, you should believe it, because it's sincere. And it will cause great and immense damage to the country. The damage may be survivable in the longer term, because we've got strong institutions and the immunity factor in our political system will still be in play. The shock to sentiment means that living standards will collapse faster. Support for the ANC and EFF will collapse quickly too. And the only way they could hold power into the longer term would be to destroy the democratic edifice, the constitutional safeguards, the rule of law, and the free electoral system. And that will be quite difficult for them to do. So, at sub 40%, these are your options. A government of national unity, very dangerous. ANC, EFF takeover, very survivable, but it's going to be very rough. And the one in the middle is the courtship option, and I think that's one that deserves serious consideration.
Look, the government of national unity would be dangerous for opposition parties, but it would give sort of stability for the country for the next 5 years, if one's looking at it from that point of view.
Well, I'm not sure that it would. I mean, as the opposition realizes that it's being compromised here, it will know, because you research these things, it will pull out. And when it pulls out, the ANC will have to find either the government keeps collapsing in votes of no confidence, which is extremely negative for sentiment. The currency suffers, all manner of things suffer, sentiment in the country suffers. So the GNU works if it holds, but it may not hold, and hence the advice. It's similar to a GNU, but very different. Don't stampede these parties into a shotgun marriage that they have to agree to in 14 days. It might not hold together. Rather, allow them to slowly find their way to each other by thinking, what is it that the ANC actually wants and needs that it can agree to and be relatively comfortable with? What is it that the opposition wants and needs and can agree to that it is comfortable with, that doesn't threaten the interests of both sides? If you identify that, that is what you need to put into a future government.
Just one last thing on this before we sort of head to closing our discussion, just around the power of provinces and decentralization versus this kind of unitary state. It seems to me that a tremendous element of success in, say, the United States of America is the fact that you have the states that have such power, and that therefore, you can have people moving between blue and red states because they're choosing policies, and a country of this vastness seems to have more decentralized power. Do you think more of that could emerge perhaps from these coalition discussions or from this election, that these big three provinces, which are the battlegrounds, maybe the IFP is going to ask for more power provincially to govern KZN, and that could be also part of Gauteng, and that is a prospect for the future of the country?
It must necessarily, if we are to be a success. This is not a case at all of waiting in hope that from the union buildings arises an enlightened administration. That is an ideal that can be pursued. But whether we get some way towards that ideal or not, the advice on what to do at community level, at ground level, at level of your business, remains unchanged. It was put best recently in an interview with a chap called Piet Leroux, who runs a very important organization called Saka Licha, and he talks about state-proofing yourself, your life. And I recommend that you put an actual link into it. People go and watch that. But wherever we have seen, particularly over the past 10 years, that it's begun to occur, that the state begins to fail and withdraw from society, we have seen strong evidence of private entry into the vacuum that's left, mitigating the damage that might otherwise have been caused. So if you draw a chart, for example, of all electricity produced in South Africa over the last 50 years, and then next to that, all the electricity produced by Eskom, in recent years, you see a gap begin to open, and the gap is private provision, the rooftop provision of electricity. It's communities, businesses on their own, starting to take for themselves what were once the responsibilities of the state. In policing, we see it as well. In around 1994, there were about 360 people in the country for every one policeman, and there were also about 360 people for every one private security guard. Today, there are about 450 people in the country for every one policeman, but about 100 for every one private security guard. So private activity has taken from the state responsibility for law and order in communities. A definition of a modern state is a monopoly on the use of force, and that has already been surrendered in South Africa to private actors. There's a chart we show for firms interested in the economy of an index of freight carried on South African railways, and how the amount of freight carried on the railways rose after 94 for a period and then fell away sharply as the railways began to collapse. And over that, we draw an index of freight carried on the roads and how private road carriers have filled the gap left by the retreating state railways. Now, we must fix the railways, and a unity or minority government anchored by the DA in Parliament could do that, and we must fix energy, as the Minister is doing, and we must obviously fix law and order. But the point is this, that a countervailing force in favour of South Africa's success is that where you as a private actor wish to step up, to take back from the state responsibilities that should, at a certain level, be state responsibilities, you will be allowed and permitted to do that. And you will be able to do that at a scale that makes a material difference to living standards within your community. And that is a lesson that's going to remain important regardless of the result on the 29th of May and regardless of the kind of government that's formed in the aftermath of that result. Strong, successful, the watershed between strong and successful South African communities of the next 20 years and those that failed and became very depressed and thought they had to leave is as much as what happens in the union buildings going to be the capacity of leaders within those communities to convince the people who they lead of the importance of taking personal responsibility to state-proof their lives, their businesses, their institutions. And if they do that, regardless, I think, of what happens in the election or what happens afterwards, communities that go to great lengths on that have a very good chance of a long, successful, peaceful and prosperous future in South Africa.
I think this is a critical point because somehow there's the sense that government is everything, and that we kind of sitting here and most people listening to us, watching us today are going to be thinking, okay, I've got my one vote. I'm going to go there and cast that vote, and then I'm going to wait to see what happens. I'm going to wait on the sidelines and say, will everything succeed or will it fail? And obviously, government and political power plays a major role and affects so much in the country. I mean, government failure in schooling, healthcare, security, these are major government failings. But I think there are 2 points that I just want to explore with you now as we draw this conversation to a close. Number one is the courage to say to the government no. I also watched that interview with Piet Leroux that Alec Hogg did with him, and he spoke there about this idea that you can say no to the government. And we need to learn that in a democracy. You don't have to say yes to everything. It's part of the journey, let's say, that we've been on as a community since October 7, where the government, South African government, ANC government, has come out the most anti-Israel democratic government in the world. And as a community, we've said, no, we don't accept that. We don't accept your position on that. We're going to build, you're cutting diplomatic ties. We're going to build our own parallel connections to the state of Israel, to the people of Israel. We're not going to be bullied and pushed around on that. And your view, sort of looking historically, this concept of saying no to the government and drawing a line and saying, pushing back. I know you had a lot of experience at the time of the campaign to push back against the confiscation of land without compensation. And now it affects also the NHI debate. There's this debate that goes on within our community and beyond, where people are saying, no, don't take such a hard line against the government, look to appease, look to accommodate, try and kind of work with them, or how do you, what's your approach on these things?
Okay, it's not my approach, it's the approach of 4,000 years of history. All political, ideological, and related contestations are settled by the forcing of a balance of power. The ability to bring hard power forward quickly. Negotiate by all means, but make sure your opponent understands that when you give them the chance to talk to you, they must take full advantage of it, because if it doesn't work, or if they betray the confidence created in the talks, you have the ability to bring power forward that can hurt their interests. Where you are able to do that successfully, you form very strong, very constructive relationships with whoever your adversary happens to be. That's, to my experience of this kind of work over many years, the greatest mistake that Westerners make, and by extension I'd say a lot of South African business leaders, is not to understand the nature of political power and how you deal with and confront political power. To appease it, to indulge it, is to encourage it to worst excesses. To stand up to it with real power, and business leaders have extraordinary power around the world, and opinion leaders have great power in shaping the views of people, which is something governments will always keep an eye on. Where you're able to bring that forward, you will form very positive relations. The ANC historically has a negotiating framework that, in a sense, it calls its balance of sort of forces theory. And it comes from Lenin's theory, and that if you probe with a bayonet and you feel mush, then you carry on, and if you hit steel, then you stop and think very carefully. And the ANC view is this, that we can advance an ideological objective when we meet with no resistance. But when resistance is encountered, we must stop and we must retreat to bring our adversary back on board with us again. And there's a reason why the ANC thinks that way, and it's that it's longer-term revolution. The current guise of the ANC commands the country today, and I'll show you now why it's different to the EFF, which is another branch of the ANC in a sense. The reason the ANC does it that way is its revolutionary objective is not to capture and seize the means of production, for the state to start sinking shafts and running mines and employing the miners. The ANC's objective is different, to regulate the means of production to the advantage of the state, and what's in an unguarded moment, a rather senior chap once put to me as a model of sustainable wealth extraction, although he regretted the fact that hadn't happened. There's a terribly different line, and this is a good thing, because it means the ANC can be managed. If you bring resistance, hard power forward, it will stop and back off. That's why when the American ambassador some months ago held a press conference and said that the South Africans had loaded weapons to murder Ukrainians onto a ship in Cape Town, Simonstown, why the ANC sent a phalanx of delegations over the Atlantic to smooth things over. That's why when we actually did run out of electricity for hours a day, the ANC made provisions for massive private investment and also totally pivoted on its own ideas about energy provision and management to put an end to load shedding. That's why even today, facing defeat, the finance minister heroically is allowing government revenue line to dictate government expenditure sideways. Expenditure's not rising, even into an election that the ANC knows it would lose. Because to borrow heavily, to print money in order to try and deal with shortfalls would trigger massive inflation, burn the country to the ground. And that's not the ANC, this guise of the ANC's revolutionary objective. So if you wish to deal with the ANC in government, understand how it enters a negotiation. Be prepared to bring, in a civil manner, it doesn't have to be adversarial, bring hard power forward, and you will have very pleasing results. ANC will be pleased as well. The EFF, however, represents a very different slant of the ANC's history, more what inside the ANC ranks you would call the ultra-leftists. The EFF view is, yes, you can advance your revolutionary objectives, and if that leads to the collapse of private enterprise, of the mining industry, that's fine, because we actually want to burn the house to the ground, so that in the aftermath of the sort of inferno, a new sort of Valhalla can be established, which of course would be a hellish sort of Venezuelan, Zimbabwean kind of society. So the two groups are terribly different, and that's just an important point to make in this interview that I imagine quite a few people might end up watching, because there is a misnomer that ANC, EFF, because they kind of sound the same, similar policies, going to have the same effect on South Africa. It won't. It will have a very different effect. But if you wish to manage this current administration, do so by confronting it with hard power in a civil and constructive manner, and you will be very pleased, I think. It will, of course, resist at first and test your resolve, which in the corporate world hasn't always been steely, as what did Helen Suzman say once, that a shiver ran around Parliament looking for a spine to run up. But a very good example of this very thing is actually relevant sitting here with you today, because the role that you played after October the 7th, as the South African government undertook actions that were hostile to and greatly threatening of South Africa's Jewish community, to stand up to those actions. You did achieve exactly that. You forced a balance of power, and you forced the South African government to slow down single-handedly. This will come out in the history. And had that not been the case, and had that resistance and that hard power not been present, I fear what would have happened to your community. And it could have been the case that the small South African Jewish community would now be on a trajectory that would mean that within a few years it would cease to exist. That was the danger, that was the depth of the hostility, that was the implication of the drift of the policy of admittedly a small minority of fundamentalists within foreign affairs. And your single-handed example put a stop to that. And I would think that anyone who has an interest in the survival of your community should be deeply grateful for what you did.
I appreciate you saying that, but I think maybe to draw the lessons from there to sort of a current example in say, the NHI debate, which I know bothers people, and the lessons you had, in say, pushing government back on the confiscation of land. And I think it also, because I think as we head towards the end of our conversation, it's about saying that we are not sort of helpless spectators on the future of South Africa. Let's start, looking, what does the future look like? We often are sitting back and saying, okay, what will the future be? Instead of saying, what kind of future do we want and how can we be part of that?
Yeah, I think that's very much the moment that we're at now, is where get on the front foot a bit here. The South African government is weak. It knows it's weak. It knows why it's failing. It understands why the civil service is failing. It's very difficult, though, in the ANC, as I've learned to understand it. It's very difficult to go to a meeting of the executive committee and stand up as a lone individual and say, I think that we're all completely mad. If we nationalise private health care, the middle class will flee, will collapse into a hellish future, and the mob will rise up and hang us as the leadership from the lampposts outside Luthuli House. It's not an organisation run by a powerful executive leader, sort of the Western model of a corporation run by a CEO who's accountable and takes executive decisions. It's not how the ANC is run at all. So looking to that individual to take a stance is useful but ultimately futile. If you shape a different climate of public opinion, your allies, of which, even if you are in the healthcare debate, there are several in the ruling administration who themselves enjoy world-class healthcare and also understand, even though they deny it in public, the vast contribution that the private healthcare industry makes in poor communities, out-of-pocket expenditure and the like. And if a body of opinion builds up in the public and the media that NHI as envisaged by the government would be wholly destructive of the country, then it becomes possible for your allies to say, well, let's just hold on here. Look at all this evidence. Look at how opinion has shifted on this. We better not proceed because we will be in very deep trouble. And NHI is an existential threat to the country because if we wreck the private healthcare sector, we won't be able to hold a middle class because no country without a world-class healthcare sector can do so. It's that simple. And a willingness within the industry to bring some hard power forward on this will, I assure you, be welcomed within some of the ranks of the ruling administration, of sensible, pragmatic people who will say, now we can no longer advance because we've hit the steel, as Lenin would have told them. And we need to back off and do something else.
And I think part of the way he's making the argument, this is not about protecting an interest group. You know, when discussing, for example, the Israel issue, part of the argument I tried to make there was to say this is actually to be pro-Israel, the only democracy in the Middle East, is actually in the interests of South Africans and the prosperity and the peace and the democracy and freedom of this country. And I think the same with the NHI debate. Actually, the greatest interest for the average South African and for those who are mired in poverty in particular is to expand the reach of the private sector to help uplift this country.
I faced a similar question this week, and I was speaking about the rooftop energy, and someone objected and said, well, it's only the rich, you know, who does all this rooftop energy really help? And I said, that's completely wrong. Millions of people keep their jobs because businesses are able to keep going because they put the solar panels on their roof. The retention of your middle class and the skills base and the capital base that it represents keeps, sustains the living standards of vast numbers of people. Private healthcare in South Africa is the same thing. I don't know why the industry doesn't say more about that. It has a vast footprint, far beyond the small relative elite who pay for high-end medical aid schemes. And its loss to the country, if you put it in the hands of the state, its loss to the country would be a loss to very many more millions of people in very many both direct and indirect ways than what its advocates suggest is a handful of the rich elite who benefit disproportionately and to the disadvantage of the poor majority. That kind of thinking is completely ignorant of the long-term and often non-linear positive benefits that flow from having a private healthcare industry as advanced and as fantastic as that South Africa currently shows.
And final question, your advice to the South African Jewish community, if you were saying to our community, you know, what would you advise heading towards the election, but in the years ahead, what would you guide?
Well, what I'd say is build incredibly strong institutions. And not just, I mean, there's some things I'm aware of. There's the cleaning up of the streets and that sort of thing, and it looks better, and apparently vastly successful security efforts and the like. And to persist in all of that, but to be even more ambitious, to build institutions of influence that can secure the climate of opinion that is necessary to allow a thriving local and maybe in the fullness of time growing. You look at the terrible anti-Semitism in the Western world. We don't have problems anything approaching that. In fact, when one of the a young chap who works in this field told me that they'd put up posters of the hostages in the city centre of Johannesburg, and the next morning the posters were still there. Whereas in London or New York, that have been ripped down within 20 minutes by some sort of terrible fundamentalist. That if you build very strong domestic institutions here and use them to build bridges into other communities that in practice have the same values, few people understand that, but it's true, then I think in a global sense, Jewish diaspora might look to South Africa with some envy as the kind of society they wish they could also perhaps live in one day.
The point that you made here about shared values and the idea, I mean, it's part of this idea that there are, the South African government and the South African people are not one and the same, and it's something that you'd mentioned in the course of this conversation. There's a bedrock of shared values across the society, and actually whatever the Jewish community needs to thrive and to succeed is exactly what all South Africans need and want, and there is that, that shared center, which in a way is exemplified by the fact that we have, as you referred, thank God, the lowest rates of anti-Semitism of any diaspora community in the world, which I don't say actually with any sense of pride or joy, because there's so much agony if you see what's happening across the American campuses now, but it is important as a revealing factor of the environment in which we live. And I think your advice here is critical, sort of looking in from the outside at a Jewish community, at world Jewry, your perspective. So, Dr. Cronje, thank you so much for your time. I think I've personally enjoyed very much hearing these perspectives. I think for our community and for our country, I want to congratulate you on the work that you're doing as the head of the SRF, which has really emerged as a cutting-edge think tank that local media but actually international media are turning to find out, well, what's happening in South Africa, what's going to happen, what's going to be more and more globally. I think they're turning to you and to the SRF and the kind of reliable data that you're putting together. So, congratulations on that, and your work and the SRF is a very important voice in South Africa and globally. And I think, as I wrap up and thank all of you for listening in, I think for us as a community at this time, as we head towards elections, firstly, it's very important that everybody go out and vote. I mean, it's a basic responsibility and obligation, a moral obligation to go out and to participate. And that's reflective of a philosophy of how we live life. We don't live life as passive victims waiting to see what tomorrow brings. We have faith in God. That's what our sages teach us. But our sages teach us as well in the Talmud that God wants us to be his partners. There's a beautiful phrase in the Talmud that I often quote, and that is that we are called upon to be shutaf la'kadosh baruch hu b'ma'aseh bereshit, God's partners in creation, which means we know we're in God's hands, and that's where our faith is, but God wants us to be his partners in making the world that we want. And it's so interesting that we're called partners in creation, because creation is about creating the future that you want and that you seek. When you're in the position of predicting, then you're like saying, what is going to happen? When you're saying, but actually, what do we want? And that's why I've enjoyed this discussion with Dr. Cronje so much, because it's not about sort of peering into the crystal ball and saying what is going to happen in the next 5 and 10 years. It's what Dr. Cronje has done so powerfully and so with such profound analysis, is saying these are the factors. These are the factors which guide towards a successful outcome. These are the risk factors. These are the various potential scenarios. These are the actions that need to be taken. And I think going forward, we need to get away from this immature approach, which in a way, I remember from my childhood, South African Jews and maybe South Africans in general growing up and saying, well, is the country going to succeed or fail? It's got another 5 years. And it's so binary. It's like either everything's amazing or it's all a disaster. And actually, life is so much more complex than that. There's so much more gray in it. And that complexity is not just in South Africa. Globally, there's so many different global challenges that the world faces. And in that murkiness of it, we have a role to play as active agents. We're not sort of predicting, is this, is the country going off the cliff, or is it, sailing into the sunset, with a glorious future? It's neither of those. It's a murky, messy space like the whole world is, and we are called on by God to be active partners in guiding and steering and playing a role in that, and to do that unapologetically, fearlessly, honestly looking at all the problems, honestly looking at all the positives, not saying, well, the problems are overwhelming or the positives are overwhelming, not looking to be in the mindset of saying, are we optimists or pessimists? It's not about saying, are we optimists or pessimists? And it's not even saying about, are we realists? It's about saying, what are the facts on the ground? What are the trends? And then asking the critical question, what can I do? What can our community do to make that better, to make a contribution, to truly be God's partner in creating a better future for us all? So thank you for being part of this, and may Hashem bless our country as it heads down this path towards elections and into the aftermath. And God bless you all, and thank you so much for listening and watching and being part of this.